The first time Rebecca Wilson collapsed in the middle of Pinecrest General Store, the whispers began. Her body convulsed against the cold linoleum floor, her eyes rolling back as Mrs. Henderson screamed for someone to call the doctor. Later, as Rebecca regained consciousness in the back room, she heard them through the thin walls. Devil's work, not right in the head, possessed. At 16, she learned quickly that in a town as small as Pinecrest, Colorado, being different wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1974 painted the Colorado mountains in fiery reds and deep oranges, but Rebecca Wilson barely noticed the beauty outside her bedroom window. At 23, her world had shrunk to the size of her family's two-story farmhouse on the outskirts of Pinecrest. The doctors in Denver had given her condition a name, epilepsy, but names didn't stop the seizures, and they certainly didn't stop the fear that followed her through the narrow streets of her hometown. "Becca, are you decent?" Her mother's voice came through the door, followed by a soft knock. "Dr. Parker is here for your checkup." Rebecca smoothed down her flannel shirt and tucked a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Parker had been the town physician since before Rebecca was born. His salt and pepper mustache and wire-rimmed glasses were as familiar to her as the wallpaper in her bedroom. But the pity in his eyes when he looked at her was something she'd only come to recognize in recent years. "How are we feeling today, Rebecca?" he asked, setting his worn leather bag on her dresser. He always said "we," as if they shared the burden of her illness. "The same," she replied, offering her wrist for the routine blood pressure check. 2 episodes this week, Tuesday evening and Thursday morning. Dr. Parker nodded, making notes in his little book. "And the new medication? Any improvement?" Rebecca thought about the small white pills that made her hands shake and her thoughts cloud over. "They make me tired. All the time. I can hardly stay awake past dinner." "That's to be expected," he said, not looking up from his notes. "Your body is adjusting. The drowsiness should pass." It was the same conversation they'd had for months, with different medications, but the same results. Either Rebecca was too drowsy to function, or the seizures continued unabated, sometimes both. After Dr. Parker left, Rebecca stood at her window watching as he climbed into his station wagon. From her second-floor vantage point, she could see most of Pinecrest, the general store where she'd had her first public seizure, the church where Pastor Mitchell had once suggested an exorcism might help her condition, and the small schoolhouse where she'd once dreamed of teaching before her. First seizure at 14 had changed everything. "He's increased your dosage," her mother said from the doorway, holding the prescription slip like it might break. Eliza Wilson had aged a decade in the 3 years since Rebecca's condition had worsened. Her once vibrant auburn hair was now streaked with gray, and worry lines had etched themselves permanently around her eyes. "It won't help," Rebecca said quietly. "None of it helps." Her mother sighed, crossing the room to stand beside her. Together they looked out at the town that had known Rebecca her entire life, yet treated her like a stranger. "Your father's driving into Thornville tomorrow for supplies. I can ask him to fill this at the pharmacy there." Rebecca nodded, though the gesture felt empty. What did it matter which pharmacy filled a prescription that wouldn't work? She'd been on 8 different medications in the past 2 years alone. The side effects varied, but the outcome remained the same. She was still the girl who might collapse. At any moment, the one people crossed the street to avoid. That evening, as her parents discussed the upcoming harvest in hushed tones at the dinner table, Rebecca pushed her food around her plate. The kitchen, with its faded yellow curtains, and the ever-present smell of her mother's bread baking, had once been her favorite room in the house. Now it felt like another place she was merely visiting, waiting until she could retreat back to her room. "Grace Miller stopped by the barn today," her father said suddenly, looking up from his stew. Matthew Wilson's hands were weathered from decades of farming, his face tanned and lined from long days in the Colorado sun. "She asked about you." Rebecca felt a flicker of surprise. Grace had been her closest friend since childhood, but like most of her relationships, their friendship had withered as her condition worsened. What did she want? "She's getting married next spring," her mother said, a forced brightness in her voice. "She wanted to know if you'd help with the preparations." The unspoken question hung in the air. Would Rebecca be well enough to attend, let alone help? Would she embarrass Grace by having an episode during the ceremony? "That's nice," Rebecca said finally, setting down her fork. "I'll write her a note tomorrow. Mater." Later that night, unable to sleep, Rebecca slipped downstairs to the kitchen. The house creaked around her, familiar sounds that had been the soundtrack to her entire life. She boiled water for tea, avoiding her reflection in the darkened window. Above the sink, her medicine cabinet had become a pharmacy unto itself, orange bottles with white caps, each promising relief that never came. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she found herself drawn to her father's desk in the corner of the living room. The top drawer was where he kept the family's emergency cash and important papers. Without fully understanding why, Rebecca pulled it open. Inside, beneath some envelopes and her father's checkbook, was a folded newspaper clipping. She recognized her father's precise handwriting on a note attached to it. "For Becca? Worth investigating?" The clipping was from the Thornville Gazette, dated just 3 weeks earlier. "Traditional healer brings ancient practices to modern medicine," read the headline. The article described a Navajo healer named Daniel Blackcloud, who had established a small practice near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, combining traditional healing methods with modern medical understanding. While conventional doctors remain skeptical, the article read, Blackcloud has gained a reputation for helping patients with conditions that Western medicine has failed to treat effectively. "Our ancestors understood the connection between body, mind, and spirit," Blackcloud explains. "Modern medicine often treats only the body, ignoring the others." Rebecca read the article twice, her tea cooling beside her. At the bottom of the clipping, her father had written an address somewhere near the Colorado-New Mexico border, at least a day's journey from Pinecrest. The kettle's whistle jerked her back to reality, and she quickly returned the clipping to its hiding place. But as she lay in bed that night, the healer's words echoed in her mind. Modern medicine often treats only the body, ignoring the others. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt something stir inside her. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. What if there was another way? What if Dr. Parker and his endless prescriptions weren't the only answer? The next morning brought one of Colorado's infamous early winter storms. Snow blanketed the farm, and Rebecca's father announced he would postpone his trip to Thornville. "Roads will be clearer in a day or two," he said over breakfast, glancing worriedly at the heavy clouds visible through the kitchen window. Rebecca nodded absently, her mind still on the newspaper clipping. She dreamed of mountains and unfamiliar landscapes, of a freedom she hadn't felt since before her diagnosis. "I need to check on the generator," her father said, pushing back from the table. "Storm like this could knock out the power." After he left, Rebecca's mother began clearing the dishes. "Why don't you help me with the mending today? I've got a basket full of your father's shirts that need attention." It was her kindness, Rebecca knew, her mother trying to give her purpose, to make her feel useful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the thought of spending another day confined to the house, anxiously waiting for the next seizure to strike, suddenly felt unbearable. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "I think I'll walk down to visit Grace, congratulate her in person." Her mother paused, a dish towel in hand. "In this weather? I don't think that's wise, Becca. The Miller farm is only 2 miles. I'll bundle up." Rebecca stood before her. Courage could falter. "I need some air, Mom. I've been cooped up for days." Her mother's expression was a familiar mixture of worry and resignation. "At least take your father's compass and be back before dark. The storm's supposed to worsen." An hour later, Rebecca stepped out into the biting cold, a backpack slung over her shoulder. Inside wasn't just the compass her mother had insisted upon, but also a change of clothes, her medication, and the money she'd been saving from the odd job she did around the farm. Not much, but enough for a bus ticket and a few meals. She didn't head toward the Miller farm. Instead, she turned south toward the highway that would take her to Thornville, and beyond that, to the address scribbled at the bottom of the newspaper clipping. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and her breath clouded in front of her face, but Rebecca felt more alive than she had in years. She had no illusions that the journey would be easy. She'd never traveled alone before, and the winter weather would make the trip even more challenging. The possibility of having a seizure while on the road terrified her. But for the first time, since her diagnosis, Rebecca was doing something other than waiting. Waiting for the next episode, waiting for a medication to work, waiting for her life to begin again. As Pinecrest disappeared behind her, Rebecca felt the weight of the town's whispers and stares lifting from her shoulders. Whether Daniel Blackcloud could help her or not, she was already experiencing a kind of healing simply by taking control of her own story. The highway stretched before her, a ribbon of grey cutting through the white landscape, leading south toward the unknown. Rebecca pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and kept walking. The Greyhound bus deposited Rebecca in Thornville just as dusk was falling. The small city was significantly larger than Pinecrest, with actual stoplights and a movie theater advertising The Godfather Part 2. She found a cheap motel near the bus station, paid for a single night, and collapsed onto the thin mattress, exhausted from the journey and the constant anxiety of traveling alone. Morning brought clear skies, but bitter cold. Rebecca studied her map, trying to determine the best route to the address from the newspaper clipping. According to the motel owner, she needed to catch another bus heading south, then find her way east toward the mountains. Not a simple journey, especially as public transportation grew sparse the further one got from civilization. By mid-afternoon, Rebecca found herself on the last bus, watching as the landscape grew increasingly wild. Pine forests gave way to rugged terrain, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks sharp against the clear, blue sky. "Last stop, folks," the driver called out eventually, pulling into what could barely be called a town. Just a gas station, a diner, and a handful of houses clustered around a single dusty street. Rebecca stepped off the bus, her backpack feeling heavier than it had that morning. According to her map, she was still at least 10 miles from her destination. As the bus pulled away, leaving her in a cloud of exhaust, the reality of her situation hit her. She was alone in an unfamiliar place, with no transportation and night approaching. The diner seemed like the safest option. Inside, the warmth and smell of coffee provided immediate relief from the cold. A few locals looked up as she entered, then returned to their meals. Rebecca approached the counter where a woman in her 60s was filling salt shakers. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, her voice sounding small in the quiet diner. "I'm trying to reach this address." She pulled out the newspaper clipping, pointing to the location written at the bottom. The woman squinted at it, then looked at Rebecca with newfound interest. "You're looking for Daniel Blackcloud?" Rebecca nodded. suddenly aware of the attention from the other patrons. "That's quite a ways up into the mountains," the woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. "No buses go that way. You'd need a car." "Is there somewhere I could rent one?" The woman laughed kindly. "Honey, this isn't Denver. Nearest car rental is back in Thornville." Rebecca's heart sank. Had she come all this way for nothing? "I could take her." The voice came from a booth in the corner. A man in his mid-30s set down his coffee cup and stood. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and features that marked him as Native American. "I'm heading that way myself," he said, approaching the counter. "If you don't mind riding in an old pickup with questionable heating." Rebecca hesitated. Getting into a vehicle with a stranger went against everything her parents had taught her. The diner owner seemed to sense her concern. "This is Joe Martinez," she said. "He delivers supplies to the communities up in the mountains. Known him since he was knee-high." Joe nodded politely. "I can drop you wherever you need to go. No trouble." With few options and darkness approaching, Rebecca agreed. 10 minutes later, she found herself in the passenger seat of a battered blue pickup truck heading up a winding mountain road. The truck's heater worked better than Joe had suggested, and Rebecca felt herself relaxing slightly as warmth returned to her fingers and toes. "So," Joe said after they'd been driving in silence for a while, "what brings you looking for Daniel Blackcloud, if you don't mind my asking?" Rebecca considered deflecting the question, but something about Joe's straightforward manner made her reconsider. "I read about him in a newspaper. He helps people with conditions that regular doctors can't treat." Joe nodded, keeping his eyes on the increasingly narrow road. "He's helped a lot of people, my sister included. Had migraines so bad she couldn't get out of bed some days. Doctors in Santa Fe just gave her pills that made her sick. And Blackcloud helped her. He did. Though he'd be the first to tell. He doesn't work miracles. Whatever you're expecting, you might want to temper it a bit." Rebecca looked out the window at the darkening forest. "At this point, I'd settle for being treated like a person instead of a medical curiosity or a burden." Joe glanced at her, his expression softening. "Well, you'll get that much at least." The road grew steeper, winding through dense pine forest. Just as Rebecca was beginning to wonder if they'd ever reach their destination, the trees opened, up to reveal a small valley nestled between mountain peaks. A cluster of buildings came into view, some traditional hogans, others modern cabins, all arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. "Welcome to Piedra Creek," Joe said, slowing the truck. "Not what you were expecting, is it?" Rebecca stared out the window. She hadn't known what to expect, but it certainly wasn't this. A community that seemed to exist in harmony with its surroundings, neither fully traditional nor completely modern. Joe parked near one of the larger cabins. "That's Daniel's place," he said, nodding toward a structure at the far end of the clearing. "But this time of evening, he'll be in the community center." He pointed to the building nearest them. They serve dinner for everyone around sunset. As they exited the truck, the cold mountain air hit Rebecca like a physical force. The altitude was higher here, making her breath come in visible puffs. Joe led the way to the community center, a large wooden building with smoke curling from its chimney. Inside was warm and surprisingly crowded. Long tables filled the space, where people of various ages and backgrounds were sharing what smelled like a hearty stew. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by occasional laughter. It struck Rebecca immediately how different this was from the strained silence of her family's dinner table. Joe waved to several people as he led Rebecca through the room. At the far end, a man was ladling stew into a child's bowl, listening intently as the little girl chattered away. He looked to be in his 50s, with long gray-streaked hair tied back from a face marked by lines that suggested both laughter and hardship. "Daniel," Joe called as they approached, "brought you a visitor." Daniel Blackcloud looked up, his dark eyes immediately finding Rebecca's. There was something in his gaze that made her feel both seen and accepted, a sensation so unfamiliar that she nearly took a step back. "Welcome," he said simply, setting down the ladle. "You've come a long way." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "You have the look," he said with a slight smile. "Someone searching for answers they couldn't find at home." He gestured to the bench across from him. "Join us for dinner. We can talk after everyone's fed." Rebecca found herself seated between Joe and an elderly woman who introduced herself as Mary. The stew was simple but delicious, and despite her anxiety, Rebecca found herself hungry for the first time in days. Throughout the meal, she observed Daniel. He spoke to everyone, from the youngest children to the oldest elders, with the same attentive respect. There was nothing mystical or dramatically spiritual about his manner. He laughed at jokes, helped serve food, and discussed practical matters like the coming winter and supplies needed for the community. As the meal wound down and people began to clear their dishes, Daniel finally turned his full attention to Rebecca. "Now," he said, "why don't you tell me what brought you all the way to Piedra Creek, Miss?" "Wilson. Rebecca Wilson." "Rebecca," he repeated, nodding. "And what is it you're hoping to find here?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She had rehearsed explanations during her journey about her epilepsy, the medications. That didn't work. The town that treated her like she was possessed. But sitting across from Daniel's steady gaze, those practiced words fell away. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just of the seizures, but of living." Daniel nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something for him. "Fear is a powerful medicine," he said. "It can keep us alive in dangerous situations, but it can also poison us when we carry it too long." He studied her face. "How long have you been carrying yours?" 9 years, Rebecca replied, "since I was 14. A look of understanding crossed Daniel's face. "And the doctors? What do they say?" "Epilepsy. They've tried everything. Medications, special diets, nothing works, not completely, and the side effects." She trailed off, thinking of the constant fatigue, the foggy thinking, the tremors in her hands. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Considering, I can't promise to cure you," he said finally. "Anyone who promises that is either a fool or a liar, but I can promise to see you, all of you, not just your condition. And perhaps together we can find a better way to live with it." The honesty of his response brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. No doctor had ever spoken to her with such straightforward respect, acknowledging both the limitations of their abilities and her humanity. "Is that enough?" Daniel asked gently. Rebecca wiped at her eyes, nodding. "It's more than I've had in a long time." Daniel smiled, the expression warming his weathered face. "Then we'll begin tomorrow. For tonight, you need rest. The journey here isn't an easy one, and the altitude takes getting used to." He looked up, searching the now quieter room. "Ah, Sarah." A woman about Rebecca's age approached, her long black hair braided over one shoulder. "This is Rebecca Wilson," Daniel said. "She'll be staying with us for a while. Can you show her to the guest cabin?" Sarah nodded, offering Rebecca a friendly smile. "Of course, follow me." As Rebecca stood to follow, Daniel caught her arm gently. "One more thing," he said, his voice low. "The path to healing isn't always comfortable. Are you prepared for that?" The question sent a chill down Rebecca's spine, but she met his gaze steadily. "I've been uncomfortable for 9 years. At least this time, it might lead somewhere better." Daniel nodded, releasing her arm. "Good. I'll see you at sunrise." as Sarah led her through the crisp night air toward a small cabin at the edge of the community. Rebecca looked up at the star-filled sky. For the first time since she could remember, the future held something other than dread, a tentative spark of possibility that she guarded carefully, afraid it might extinguish with the slightest breath of doubt. The guest cabin was simple but comfortable, with a wood stove already lit and warming the single room. A narrow bed with thick blankets stood against one wall, and a small table with a kerosene lamp provided soft light. "Bathroom's out back," Sarah explained, pointing to a door at the rear of the cabin. "It's just an outhouse, but it's clean. If you need anything during the night, my cabin is the next one over." After Sarah left, Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what she had done. She had left home without a word, traveled to a remote community in the mountains, and put her trust in a man she knew only from a newspaper clipping. Yet as she looked around the small cabin, feeling its solid walls and the warmth of the fire, Rebecca couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. For better or worse, she had chosen her own path for the first time since her diagnosis. Whatever came next, that choice was already a kind of healing. She unpacked her few belongings, carefully setting her medication bottles on the small table. As she changed into her night clothes, a wave of exhaustion hit her. The journey, the altitude, the emotional intensity of the day, it all caught up with her at once. Rebecca slipped under the heavy blankets, the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain, night filtering through the cabin walls. As she drifted towards sleep, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had gone to bed, feeling something other than resignation or dread. Tonight, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, she felt something different, a quiet determination, and beneath it, the faintest flicker of hope. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that spoke of wild places and unknown paths. Rebecca pulled the blankets tighter and closed her eyes, ready at last to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Rebecca woke to the gentle sound of knocking. For a moment, disoriented in the unfamiliar cabin, she thought she was back in Pinecrest. Then reality settled around her, the small wooden room, the embers glowing in the stove, the crisp mountain air seeping through the walls. "Rebecca?" Sarah's voice came through the door. "Daniel's waiting. Sun's almost up." Rebecca scrambled out of bed, shivering as the cold air hit her skin. She dressed quickly, splashed water on her face from the basin by the door, and swallowed her morning medication dry. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her coat as she stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah waited, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, her breath visible in the cold. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Rebecca admitted, surprised to realize it was true. Despite the strange surroundings, she had slept deeply, without the usual anxiety that plagued her nights in Pinecrest. Sarah led her through the silent community. Most of the cabins were dark, though a few showed the warm glow of early risers. As they walked, the eastern sky began to lighten, the stars fading one by one. The mountains loomed large against the brightening horizon. Daniel was waiting at the edge of the settlement, seated on a flat rock overlooking the valley below. He didn't turn as they approached, his gaze fixed on the lightening sky. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly. "You can go back now." Sarah squeezed Rebecca's arm encouragingly before turning back toward the cabins. Rebecca stood awkwardly, unsure if she should speak or sit. "Join me," Daniel said, patting the rock beside him. "The sunrise here is worth witnessing." Rebecca sat, pulling her coat tighter against the biting cold. Below them, the valley was still in shadow, but the mountain peaks were beginning to catch the first golden light of dawn. "In Navajo tradition," Daniel said, his voice soft but clear in the still morning air, "we greet each day with prayers because each sunrise is a new beginning, a new chance to walk in beauty." As he spoke, the sun crested the eastern mountains, sending shafts of golden light across the valley. The effect was breathtaking, the darkness receding, the landscape revealed in all its rugged beauty. "Today is your new beginning," Daniel continued, "but before we can move forward, we need to understand where you're starting from." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Tell me about your first seizure." Rebecca swallowed hard. It wasn't the question she had expected. "I was 14, she began, her voice catching. "It was during a school performance. I was playing piano for the spring concert." The memory was still vivid. The bright lights of the school auditorium, the sheet music in front of her, the familiar keys beneath her fingers, then the strange sensation like the world was tilting sideways. I remember the lights seemed too bright suddenly. Then there was this taste, like metal in my mouth. Then, nothing. She looked down at her hands. "They told me later I fell off the bench, that I was shaking and there was foam coming from my mouth. When I woke up, everyone was staring. My mother was crying. Someone had put their belt in my mouth. They thought I might swallow my tongue." Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression neither pitying nor judgmental. "After that, everything changed," Rebecca continued. "The doctor in Pinecrest said it was probably just stress, maybe female hysteria." She laughed bitterly. "But when it happened again, 2 weeks later, my parents took me to a specialist in Denver. That's when they diagnosed the epilepsy." "And the treatments?" Daniel prompted. "Medications mostly. None worked completely, and all had side effects. One made me so dizzy I could barely stand. Another gave me horrible rashes. The current one makes me foggy, like I'm always half asleep." She hesitated. There was talk of surgery, but the risks were too high. Daniel nodded slowly. "And how did your community respond?" Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Some were kind. At first, brought casseroles, offered to pray, but when the seizures didn't stop." She trailed off, remembering the whispers, the sideways glances. "They got scared, started saying it was spiritual, not medical, that I was possessed or being punished for something." "And you, what do you believe causes your seizures?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she thought about her own condition. "The doctors say it's electrical, misfiring signals in my brain. That makes sense to me, but sometimes..." She hesitated, afraid of sounding foolish. "Sometimes," Daniel encouraged. "Sometimes it feels like more than that. Like my body knows something is coming before my mind does. Like a storm gathering inside me that I can't control." Daniel nodded, a spark of interest in his eyes. "That's a good description. The Navajo understanding of illness isn't so different from your electrical explanation. We see the body as a system that must be in harmony with itself, with nature, with the community. When that harmony is disrupted, illness follows." He stood, brushing off his pants. "Come, it's time for breakfast, and after that, we begin." The community center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Children raced between tables, while adults chatted over steaming cups of coffee. The atmosphere reminded Rebecca of town gatherings in Pinecrest, except for one crucial difference. No one stared when she entered. No conversation stopped abruptly at her approach. Breakfast was simple, cornmeal porridge with honey and dried fruit, but Rebecca ate with unexpected appetite. Daniel introduced her to several community members, including an older woman named Clara, who, he explained, would be working with them. After breakfast, Daniel led Rebecca to a smaller building at the edge of the settlement. Inside was a single room with a packed earth floor. A fire burned in a central pit, filling the space with warmth and the fragrant scent of cedar. Clara joined them carrying a basket of herbs and roots. Without speaking, she began adding small amounts to the fire, creating aromatic smoke that filled the room. "First, we cleanse," Daniel explained, motioning for Rebecca to sit on a woven mat near the fire. "The smoke helps clear away negative energies, makes space for healing." Rebecca watched as Clara moved around the fire with practiced precision, her weathered hands working with the herbs. There was nothing mystical or theatrical about her movements, just the assured efficiency of someone who had performed the same task countless times. Daniel sat across from Rebecca, the fire between them. In the Navajo way, healing isn't just about the individual. It's about restoring harmony between the person and everything around them: family, community, nature, the spiritual world. "I don't have much harmony to restore," Rebecca said quietly. "My family tries, but they don't understand. And the town." She shook her head. "Then we start with what we can control, the harmony within you." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something important. Have you noticed patterns to your seizures? Times of day, activities, emotions that might trigger them?" Rebecca thought for a moment. "They're more common when I'm tired or stressed. Sometimes bright, flickering lights can trigger them. And..." She hesitated. "They often come around dawn or dusk when the light is changing." Daniel exchanged a glance with Clara, who nodded slowly. "What?" Rebecca asked, noticing their reaction. "Transitions," Daniel said. "Dawn and dusk are powerful transition times. Not day, not night, but the space between. Those in-between times have spiritual significance in many traditions, including ours." He leaned forward, his expression intent. "I believe your body is especially sensitive to these transition states. Your brain's electrical activity may be responding to subtle changes that others don't perceive." It was the first explanation that had ever made Rebecca feel like her condition might be something other than a defect, not a curse or a punishment, but a different way of experiencing the world. "Today," Daniel continued, "we'll work on two things. First, Clara will teach you about herbs that might help stabilize your system during these transition times. Second, I'll show you a form of meditation that can help you recognize the early warning signs of a seizure, perhaps even give you enough time to prepare to find safety." The day passed in a blur of new experiences. Clara taught Rebecca to identify and prepare specific herbs: valerian root for calming the nervous system, passion flower to help with sleep, and a bitter root Rebecca didn't recognize that Clara said would quiet the storms in her brain. Daniel, meanwhile, showed her a meditation technique that involved focused breathing and visualization. "Imagine your awareness as a bird," he instructed, "circling high above your body. When you feel the first signs of a seizure coming, the metallic taste, the strange sensations, let your awareness rise above it. You won't stop the seizure, but you might gain precious seconds of control." By late afternoon, Rebecca was exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt like an active participant in her own healing, not just a passive recipient of treatments that others decided for her. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Daniel suggested they take a walk. "The movement will help your body process everything you've learned today," he explained, as they followed a narrow path that wound along the edge of the settlement. "Tell me about your life in Pinecrest," Daniel said, after they had walked in comfortable silence for a while. "Not just the seizures, but who you are beyond them." Rebecca thought about the question. Who was she beyond her condition? It had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything other than the girl with seizures that she struggled to answer. "I used to play piano," she said finally. "I was good at it before everything changed. And I wanted to teach. Elementary, school maybe, I love children." She kicked at a stone on the path. "That seems impossible now. Who would trust their children with someone who might collapse at any moment?" Children are often more accepting than adults, Daniel observed, less fixed in their thinking. Maybe, Rebecca conceded, though she couldn't imagine any parent in Pinecrest allowing her to teach their children. What about friends, family? My parents try. They love me, but they're afraid all the time, afraid I'll hurt myself, afraid of what people think. She sighed. Most of my friends drifted away after the seizures started, except Grace. She stuck around longer than most, but even she has her own life now, getting married next spring. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Illness can be isolating. People fear what they don't understand. Including me, Rebecca admitted. I've been afraid of my own body for years. They had reached a clearing where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the valley below. Daniel sat, motioning for Rebecca to join him. Fear serves a purpose, he said, as they watched the shadows lengthening across the landscape. It warns us of danger, but when it becomes constant, it takes more than it gives. Rebecca nodded, thinking of all the things fear had taken from her: education, friendships, independence, joy. Tomorrow, Daniel continued, we'll begin working with your fear directly. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. But what will we do? Rebecca asked, a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Daniel's expression was gentle but firm. We'll invite a seizure. Rebecca stared at him, certain she had misheard. Invite? But I've spent years trying to prevent them. Exactly. You've been at war with your own body, fighting a battle you cannot win. To find harmony, you must first make peace with what is. The idea terrified her. Seizures were something that happened to her, not something she chose. The thought of willingly entering that state of vulnerability and loss of control made her stomach clench with fear. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel added, You won't be alone. I'll be with you the entire time, as will Clara. We'll create a safe space for it to happen. Rebecca looked out over the valley, her thoughts churning. Everything in her wanted to refuse, to cling to the illusion of control that had sustained her for years. But hadn't that approach led her here, desperate enough to seek help from a stranger in the mountains? Okay, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I'll try. Daniel nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. Good. Now, let's head back before it gets dark. The path can be treacherous at night. As they walked back toward the settlement, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Rebecca felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring something she had never considered possible, a direct confrontation with the very thing that had defined and limited her life for nearly a decade. That night, after a quiet dinner in the community center, Rebecca returned to her cabin. Sarah had left a fresh pot of tea steeping by the stove, its herbal scent filling the small space. A handwritten note explained it was a blend to help with sleep and calm the nervous system. As Rebecca sipped the tea, seated on the edge of her bed, she realized she hadn't taken her evening medication. The pill bottles sat on the small table where she had left them that morning. After a moment's hesitation, she decided to skip the dose. If tomorrow was about facing her condition directly, perhaps it was better to do so without the medication's blunting effect. Sleep came surprisingly easily, the tea's gentle sedative effect combining with the physical and emotional exhaustion of the day. Rebecca drifted off to the sound of the wind in the pines, dreamless and deep. Morning arrived with a soft knock at her door. This time, it was Daniel himself who waited outside, a steaming mug in his hands. "Drink this," he said, handing her the mug. "It will help prepare your system." The liquid was bitter despite the honey that had been added. Rebecca drank it without complaint, trusting Daniel's guidance despite her apprehension about what lay ahead. They walked in silence to the small building where they had worked the previous day. Inside, Clara was already tending the fire. The room warm and filled with the now familiar scent of cedar smoke. "Sit," Daniel instructed, indicating a pile of soft blankets arranged near the fire. Rebecca settled onto the blankets, her heart racing. Clara approached, kneeling beside her with a small wooden bowl containing a paste of crushed herbs. "This goes on your temples and the back of your neck," she explained, her voice gentle. "It helps open the pathways." The paste was cool and smelled of mint and something earthy Rebecca couldn't identify. Clara's fingers were gentle as she applied it, murmuring softly in Navajo as she worked. When she was finished, Daniel sat across from Rebecca, the fire between them as it had been the day before. "Today we don't fight the seizure," he explained. "Today we listen to what it might be trying to tell you." Rebecca nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She had never thought of her seizures as having a message, only as an enemy to be battled or endured. "Close your eyes," Daniel instructed. "Focus on your breathing first, deep and slow." Rebecca obeyed, concentrating on the rhythm of her breath, feeling the rise and fall of her chest. The fire's warmth enveloped her, and the herbs on her skin created a tingling sensation that was not unpleasant. "Now," Daniel's voice came from what seemed a great distance. "I want you to remember your first seizure, not the fear or the aftermath, but the moments just before, the sensations in your body, the awareness that something was changing." Rebecca focused, reaching back through the years to that spring concert, the bright lights of the auditorium, the familiar notes of Chopin beneath her fingers, then the strange tilting sensation, as if the world had shifted on its axis. "There was pressure," she said softly, her eyes still closed. "Like something building inside my head, and the light seemed too bright, too sharp. Colors were more intense. Then the metallic taste and everything started to feel distant." "Good." Daniel's voice was steady, encouraging. "Stay with those sensations. Don't run from them. Observe them as if they belonged to someone else." Rebecca concentrated, allowing herself to fully recall the sensations she had spent years trying to ignore or suppress. As she did, she felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a pressure building at the base of her skull. "It's starting," she whispered, a thread of panic in her voice. "I'm here," Daniel reassured her. "Clara is here, you're safe. Don't fight it, observe it." The pressure increased, and Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. The metallic taste flooded her mouth, and the familiar disorientation began to take hold. Every instinct screamed for her to fight it, to pull herself back from the edge. "Let go." Daniel's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Trust your body." With a final conscious effort, Rebecca surrendered. The seizure took her, but somehow it felt different. She was still aware, floating above the experience even as her body convulsed. She could sense Daniel and Clara moving around her, ensuring she was safe, but there was no fear in their movements, no panic. Time lost meaning. Rebecca floated in a space between consciousness and unconsciousness, aware of her body's struggle, yet somehow separate from it. Images flashed through her mind. Her mother's worried face, the piano keys beneath her fingers, the mountains at dawn. When awareness finally returned fully, Rebecca found herself lying on the blankets, a soft pillow beneath her head. Clara sat nearby, watching her with calm, attentive eyes. The fire had burned lower, suggesting some time had passed. "Welcome back," Daniel said from somewhere to her right. Rebecca turned her head, wincing at the soreness in her neck and shoulders. Daniel sat cross-legged a few feet away, his expression thoughtful. "How do you feel?" he asked. Rebecca took inventory of her body. The usual post-seizure symptoms were there: fatigue, muscle aches, slight confusion. But something was different. The overwhelming shame and despair that typically followed an episode were notably absent. "Tired," she said honestly. Sore, but okay. Better than usual. Daniel nodded, as if this confirmed something for him. You remained partially aware throughout. That's significant. Rebecca blinked in surprise. Is that possible? The awareness you've been cultivating through meditation created a space between you and the seizure. You weren't completely lost. In it. He leaned forward, his expression intense. This is just the beginning, Rebecca. With practice, you might be able to maintain even more awareness, maybe even regain some control during episodes. The implications of this were staggering. Rebecca had always experienced seizures as a complete loss of control, a terrifying surrender to forces beyond her understanding. The idea that she might maintain some awareness, some connection to herself during these episodes, offered a kind of hope she had never considered possible. Rest now, Daniel said, seeing the exhaustion in her face. We'll talk more later. Clara helped Rebecca to her feet and back to her cabin, where she collapsed onto the bed, her body demanding sleep. As consciousness slipped away, a single thought followed her into dreams. For the first time in 9 years, she had faced her greatest fear directly and survived. When Rebecca woke, the quality of light suggested late afternoon. Her body ached as it always did after a seizure, but her mind felt surprisingly clear. The usual mental fog that accompanied her episodes was noticeably lighter. A knock at the doctor roused her fully. "Come in," she called, pushing herself up to sitting. Joe Martinez entered, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl and a mug. "Daniel asked me to bring you something to eat," he explained, setting the tray on the small table. "Said you'd need your strength." The soup was thick with vegetables and fragrant with herbs. Rebecca hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma hit her. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tray gratefully. Joe lingered by the door, seemingly hesitant to leave. "Daniel told me what you did today," he said finally. "Takes courage to face something like that head-on." Rebecca shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "I didn't have many options left." Still, not everyone would have the guts. He paused. "My sister, the one with the migraines, she went through something similar. Said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it changed everything for her." "How is she now?" Rebecca asked, blowing on a spoonful of soup. "Good days and bad still, but the bad ones don't own her anymore." Joe smiled, a quick flash of warmth. "Anyway, I'll let you rest. Community dinner's in about an hour, if you're feeling up to it." After he left, Rebecca ate slowly, savoring the simple, nourishing food. As her strength returned, she found herself reflecting on the morning's experience. The seizure itself had been like others she'd experienced, the same electrical storm in her brain, the same loss of physical control. But her relationship to it had somehow shifted. By choosing to face it rather than fear it, she had reclaimed a small measure of agency. When she had finished eating, Rebecca washed her face in the basin and changed into fresh clothes. Her reflection in the small mirror showed the usual post-seizure pallor. But her eyes seemed different, clearer, more present. The community center was alive with activity when she arrived. Children darted between tables, adults gathered in conversation groups, and the air was filled with the scent of cooking food. No one treated Rebecca with the awkward concern she was accustomed to after a seizure. Instead, she received simple nods of acknowledgement, as if what she had experienced was natural, even valuable. Daniel waved her over to where he sat with several elders. "Feeling stronger?" he asked as she joined them. Rebecca nodded. "Different, somehow." "Of course," said an elderly man seated next to Daniel. "You've seen your enemy's face now. Makes it harder for it to hide in shadows." Daniel introduced the man as Thomas, one of the community's respected elders. "Thomas has worked with me for many years, helping those with conditions similar to yours." "Similar?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "You've treated epilepsy before?" Not precisely, Thomas replied, but conditions where the body and spirit move, between worlds, where consciousness shifts in ways others don't understand. In the old days, such people were often respected as having special connections to the spirit world. The concept was so at odds with Rebecca's experience, being treated as damaged, dangerous, even possessed, that she couldn't immediately process it. "Tomorrow," Daniel said, changing the subject gently, "we begin the real work. Today was about facing your fear. Tomorrow is about rebuilding your relationship with your body." "Will I have another seizure?" Rebecca asked, unable to keep the apprehension from her voice. While today's experience had been enlightening, it had also been exhausting. "No," Daniel assured her, "that's not necessary right now. Tomorrow is about learning to listen to the early warnings your body gives you and developing techniques to respond differently." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and shared food. Rebecca found herself drawn into discussions about everyday matters. The coming winter, repairs needed to one of the community buildings, a child's first words. No one asked about her condition or treated her with the wary distance she had grown accustomed to in Pinecrest. Later, as Rebecca walked back to her cabin under a star-filled sky, she realized something profound had shifted within her. The seizure. She had experienced that morning, an event that would typically have left her devastated and withdrawn for days, had become simply another experience, neither defining nor diminishing her. Sarah joined her on the path, falling into step beside her. "You did well today," she said, her breath visible in the cold night air. "Daniel told you?" Sarah nodded. He was impressed. "Said you showed unusual awareness for someone so early in the process." Rebecca wasn't sure how to respond to praise for something that had always been seen as a failure, her brain's inability to function normally. "It gets easier," Sarah continued. "Not the seizures themselves, maybe, but living with them. My brother had a similar condition. That's how our family first came to Daniel." "Had?" Rebecca asked, noting the past tense. "He still has episodes occasionally, but he's learned to work with them rather than against them. He's a teacher now, up in Santa Fe." The simple statement hit Rebecca with unexpected force. A teacher, the very profession she had abandoned as impossible. "How does he manage? With the students, I mean. He's open about it. The school knows, the children know. When he feels an episode coming, he has a system. One of the older students gets the principal. The others continue their work until he's ready to teach again." Sarah shrugged. "It's just part of who he is, not something to hide or fear." The concept was so foreign to Rebecca's experience that she struggled to imagine it. A life where her condition was accommodated rather than hidden, where it was seen as a difference rather than a defect. At her cabin door, Sarah paused. "Daniel asked me to give you this." She handed Rebecca a small leather pouch. "Herbs for dreaming. Put them under your pillow tonight." Alone in her cabin, Rebecca prepared for bed, placing the fragrant pouch beneath her pillow as instructed. As she drifted towards sleep, her thoughts returned to Sarah's brother, teaching despite his seizures, living a life defined by his passions, rather than his limitations. For the first time in years, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine a similar future for herself, not cured perhaps, but whole in a different way. Her dreams that night were vivid and strange, filled with images of mountains and rivers, paths winding through forests, doors opening onto unexpected landscapes. She woke with the sensation of having traveled a great distance, though her body had remained in the small cabin bed. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline autumn day that promised winter's approach. Rebecca dressed warmly, anticipating another day spent in the healing lodge with Daniel and Clara. But when she stepped outside, Daniel was waiting on the path, dressed for hiking, a small pack on his shoulders. "We're going up," he said, nodding toward the mountains that rose behind the settlement. "The work we need to do today requires a different space." Rebecca glanced down at her clothes, wondering if she was dressed appropriately for mountain hiking. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel handed her a woolen hat and a pair of leather gloves from his pack. "The trail isn't difficult, but the altitude makes everything more challenging. We'll take it slow." They set off through the settlement, past the last cabins, and onto a narrow trail that wound upward through stands of pine and aspen. The air grew thinner as they climbed, and Rebecca found herself breathing harder, her legs protesting the unfamiliar exertion. Daniel set a deliberate pace, stopping occasionally to point out medicinal plants or to allow Rebecca to rest. They didn't speak much as they climbed, the rhythm of walking and breathing creating its own form of meditation. After about an hour, the trail leveled out, opening onto a small plateau. A circle of stones marked what was clearly a ceremonial space, with a central fire pit and 4 larger stones at the cardinal points. The view was breathtaking, mountains stretching to the horizon in every direction, the valley where Piedra Creek lay spread out below them like a map. "This is a healing ground," Daniel explained as Rebecca caught her breath. "A place between earth and sky where transitions are honored." He gestured for her to sit on one of the larger stones that faced east. The rock was cold beneath her, but somehow not uncomfortable. Daniel began gathering kindling and small branches from the edge of the clearing, methodically building a fire in the central pit. "Yesterday," he said as he worked, "you faced your seizure directly. Today, we work on recognizing the transition time before it happens, the aura, as your doctors probably call it." Rebecca nodded. The medical term for the strange sensations that preceded her seizures had always seemed inadequate, too clinical to capture the eerie, altered state she experienced. "Those moments are precious," Daniel continued. "They're a warning, yes, but also an opportunity. A space between worlds where choices are still possible." He struck a match, lighting the carefully arranged kindling. The fire caught quickly, flames dancing in the clear mountain air. "Close your eyes," Daniel instructed, moving to sit across the fire from her. "Remember the sensations that came before yesterday's seizure, the pressure, the changes in perception." Rebecca closed her eyes, easily summoning the memory of the building tension in her skull, the metallic taste, the heightened perception of light and color. "Now," Daniel's voice came through the darkness behind her eyelids. "Imagine those sensations beginning now. Feel the pressure starting to build." It was difficult at first. Without the actual biochemical processes of a seizure in progress, Rebecca struggled to simulate the sensations. But as she concentrated, focusing on her detailed memories of countless episodes, she found she could create a shadow version of the experience, not the seizure itself, but a remembered echo of its approach. "I feel it," she said softly, her eyes still closed. "Or at least I remember feeling it." "Good. Now instead of tensing against it, breathe into it. Direct your breath to wherever the pressure is building." Rebecca focused her awareness on the base of her skull, where the tension typically began. She imagined her breath flowing to that spot, warming and expanding. "The seizure wants to protect you," Daniel said, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that matched the crackling of the fire. "Your brain senses something it cannot integrate, so it resets itself, like a circuit breaker tripping when there's too much electrical load." The analogy made intuitive sense to Rebecca. She'd never thought of her seizures as protective, only as disruptive and frightening. "What is your brain protecting you from?" Daniel asked, the question hanging in the clear mountain air. Rebecca had no immediate answer. Her doctors had never suggested her epilepsy served any purpose. It was simply a malfunction, a defect in her neurological wiring. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps that's what we need to discover." Daniel's voice shifted, becoming practical again. "Open your eyes. Rebecca blinked against the brightness of the day. The fire had grown stronger, sending tendrils of smoke into the cloudless sky. "Western medicine sees your seizures as the enemy," Daniel said, his eyes reflecting the flames between them. "But in our traditions, imbalance isn't something to be fought, it's something to be understood. Your body is trying to tell you something. Our job is to learn how to listen." He reached into his pack, withdrawing a small clay jar. Opening it, he sprinkled some of its contents into the fire. Sweet-smelling smoke billowed up, enveloping them both. "Today we practice 3 things," Daniel explained. "First, recognizing the earliest signs of a coming seizure. Second, creating a safe response, not panic, not resistance, but purposeful action. Third, understanding what your body might be trying to communicate." The remainder of the morning was spent in a series of exercises, breathing techniques, visualization practices, even physical movements designed to redirect the electrical storm, as Daniel put it. By midday, Rebecca was mentally exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, she felt like she was developing actual tools to work with her condition, not just medications to suppress it. As they sat, sharing a simple lunch of dried meat, bread, and apples, Rebecca found the courage to ask a question that had been forming since their arrival. "Daniel, what you said about my brain protecting me, do you really believe that? That these seizures could have a purpose?" Daniel considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful in the midday light. "I believe nothing in nature is random," he said finally. "Your brain's sensitivity, its tendency to reset itself under certain conditions, may be serving a function we don't yet understand." "Like what?" "That's something only you can discover." He met her gaze directly. "But I have observed patterns. People with conditions like yours often have unusual sensitivities to changes in light, in atmospheric pressure, in energy. Some cultures would see these sensitivities as gifts, not disabilities." Back in her cabin, Rebecca found a fresh pot of tea and a plate of bread and cheese waiting for her. Sarah's thoughtfulness touched her deeply. Such simple kindnesses had been rare in her life since her diagnosis. She ate slowly, watching through the small window as the settlement prepared for evening, people moving with purpose between buildings, smoke rising from chimneys against the darkening sky. That night, Rebecca dreamed of pianos. She stood on a stage, fingers poised above keys that stretched endlessly in both directions. When she began to play, each note produced not sound but color, vibrant bursts of light that filled the empty auditorium. In the dream, she felt no fear, only wonder as the colors danced around her, responding to her touch. Morning came with a heavy mist that shrouded the mountains and turned the settlement into a ghostly landscape of shadowy figures and muffled sounds. Rebecca dressed warmly, anticipating another day of work with Daniel. But when she stepped outside, it was Clara, who waited on the path. "Daniel has asked me to work with you today," the older woman said, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "He has matters to attend to in another community." Rebecca felt a flicker of disappointment, quickly followed by curiosity. Clara had been a quiet presence during her sessions with Daniel, but Rebecca had sensed a deep knowledge in the woman's careful movements and watchful eyes. Clara led her not to the healing lodge, but to her own home, a traditional hogan set slightly apart from the other dwellings. Inside, the circular space was warm and fragrant, with herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. A loom occupied one section, a half-finished blanket of intricate design taking shape on its frame. "Sit," Clara instructed, gesturing to a woven mat near the central fire pit. As Rebecca settled herself, Clara moved about the space with the unhurried efficiency of someone completely at home in their environment, gathering small jars and bundles of dried plants. Daniel tells me you've begun to understand the language of your body, she said, kneeling across from Rebecca. Today, we work on listening more deeply. From a wooden box, Clara withdrew a small drum, its surface decorated with symbols Rebecca didn't recognize. In our tradition, rhythm helps the body remember its natural patterns, she explained, demonstrating a gentle, steady beat. When illness comes, those patterns are disrupted. The drum can help restore them. She handed the instrument to Rebecca, who took it hesitantly. I don't know how to play. Clara's weathered face creased in a smile. Your heartbeat knows. Listen to it first, then match your hands to its rhythm. Rebecca closed her eyes, becoming aware of her heart's steady pulse. After a moment, she began tapping the drum lightly, synchronizing with her own internal rhythm. The simple activity was surprisingly calming, focusing her attention on the most basic function of her living body. Good, Clara said after several minutes. Now, I want you to remember the feeling just before a seizure begins. Not the seizure itself, but the earliest warning. Rebecca's hands faltered on the drum as anxiety flickered through her. Clara reached out, steadying her wrists. No fear, she said firmly. Just memory. Your body speaks to you before the storm. We need to learn its language. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca closed her eyes again, summoning the memory of pre-seizure sensations. The pressure at the base of her skull, the metallic taste, the heightened awareness of light and sound. When you feel these warnings, Clara continued, change your drum beat. Let it match the new rhythm your body is creating. The concept was strange, but compelling. Rebecca had never thought of her seizures as having a rhythm, only as a chaotic electrical storm that overwhelmed her brain's normal functioning. Under Clara's guidance, she spent the morning exploring this new perspective, using the drum to externalize and express the changing states of her body. By midday, she had developed a basic vocabulary of rhythms, the steady beat of normal awareness, the quickening tempo that signaled rising tension, the complex patterns that emerged in the transitional state before a seizure. Your body is not your enemy, Clara said, as they shared a simple meal of corn cakes and dried fruit. It speaks its own language. Most illness comes when we forget how to listen. But epilepsy is physical, Rebecca objected. It's electrical, misfiring in the brain. Clara nodded, unperturbed by the challenge. Yes, and what causes the electricity to misfire? The question stumped Rebecca. Her doctors had never offered an explanation for why her brain behaved as it did, only that it was a neurological condition she would likely have for life. Many things can disrupt the body's electrical system, Clara continued. Injury, poison, emotions locked too long inside. She fixed Rebecca with a penetrating gaze. What were you feeling before your first seizure? Rebecca started to say she couldn't remember, but the words died on her lips. The memory of that day, the spring concert, the auditorium filled with parents and teachers, suddenly came into sharp focus. I was afraid, she admitted quietly, not of playing. I'd performed many times before. But my father had been arguing with my teacher. He thought I should be focusing on more practical studies, not music. She swallowed hard, surprised by the emotion rising in her throat. Right before I went on stage, he told me it would be my last performance, that we couldn't afford to indulge my hobby anymore. Clara's expression remained neutral, but her eyes reflected understanding. So, your heart was heavy when you sat at the piano. Rebecca nodded, the realization washing over her. I was playing Chopin, but inside I was screaming. The memory unleashed others, the pressure to be perfect, to justify her love of music through flawless performance, the growing tension between her passion and her father's practical concerns about her future. How strange that in 9 years of medical consultations, no doctor had ever asked what she was feeling before that first seizure. "The body remembers," Clara said simply, "even when the mind tries to forget." The afternoon brought a shift in their work. Having explored the rhythms of Rebecca's experience through the drum, Clara introduced her to movement. In the open space at the center of the hogan, she taught Rebecca a series of flowing gestures, explaining that they helped balance the body's energy pathways. "When you feel the warning signs," Clara instructed, "don't freeze in fear. Move. Let the energy flow rather than build up." The movements were simple but precisely choreographed. A turning of the head, a sweeping motion of the arms, a shifting of weight from one foot to the other. Clara explained that they were drawn from traditional healing dances, adapted for Rebecca's specific condition. By late afternoon, Rebecca was physically tired but mentally invigorated. The combination of rhythm and movement had given her a new vocabulary for understanding and responding to her body's signals. For the first time, she could imagine having options when she felt a seizure approaching, not just fear and helpless, waiting, but purposeful action. As they concluded their session, Clara handed Rebecca a small leather pouch filled with herbs. "Brew this as tea when you feel the pressure building," she instructed. "It won't stop a seizure, but it may soften its edges." Rebecca accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for today," she said, "for helping me listen differently." Clara's weathered face softened into a smile. "You were ready to hear? Many are not." Walking back to her cabin in the gathering dusk, Rebecca felt a curious lightness despite her physical fatigue. The day's work had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of her condition. Her epilepsy was still present, still part of her reality, but it no longer loomed as an incomprehensible enemy. There was a pattern to it, a language she was beginning to decipher. The settlement was quiet as she made her way through, most families already gathered in their homes for the evening meal. As she approached her cabin, she noticed a figure sitting on the small bench outside her door. Joe Martinez rose as she drew near, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Rebecca," he greeted her with a nod, "got a moment to talk?" She nodded, sensing something important in his demeanor. They sat together on the bench, the last light of day fading from the sky above the mountains. "Daniel asked me to tell you," Joe began, "that tomorrow we need to go back to Thornville." Rebecca felt a jolt of surprise. "Thornville? Why?" Joe hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There's a situation you should know about. Your father is there looking for you." The news hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Of course, her parents would search for her. She had left without explanation, without even a note, but she hadn't expected them to track her this far, to this remote community. "How did he find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Small towns have long memories," Joe said with a shrug. "Someone at the diner in Gateway must have mentioned you were asking about Daniel. Your father arrived there yesterday, asking the same questions." Rebecca's mind raced. Was she ready to face her father, to explain her decision to seek healing outside the medical system he trusted? The thought of returning to Pinecrest, to the life of limitation and barely concealed pity, made her stomach clench with dread. "I don't want to go back," she said, the words emerging with surprising force. Joe nodded, unsurprised by her reaction. "Daniel thought you might feel that way. He said to tell you this is your choice. But he also said that healing sometimes means facing what we've left behind." Rebecca stared out at the darkening settlement, weighing her options. She could refuse to go, could hide in this mountain community where she had found more acceptance in a few days than in years at home. But that would leave her parents in anguish, wondering if she was alive or dead, and it would mean running from a confrontation that perhaps needed to happen. "When do we leave?" she asked finally. "First light," Joe replied. "It's a long drive, and Daniel wants to meet us there by midday." After Joe left, Rebecca sat alone on the bench for a long time, watching as stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. The prospect of seeing her father stirred a complex mix of emotions: love and resentment, longing and fear. How could she make him understand what she had discovered here? That her healing wasn't about finding a cure, but about finding a different way to live with her condition. Sleep was elusive that night. Rebecca lay awake, rehearsing conversations with her father, imagining scenarios ranging from tearful reconciliation to angry confrontation. When fatigue finally claimed her, her dreams were fragmented and restless. Dawn came too quickly. Rebecca dressed mechanically, packing her few belongings and the precious herbs Clara had given her. As she stepped outside, the settlement was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from morning fires, a few early risers moving between buildings. Joe waited by his truck, engine already running. "Ready?" he asked as she approached. Rebecca nodded, though readiness was the last thing she felt. They drove in silence as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The beauty of it struck Rebecca anew, and she realized how quickly she had come to love this wild, rugged country. "Daniel says you've made good progress," Joe commented as they descended toward more populated areas, leaving the highest peaks behind. "I've learned a lot," Rebecca agreed. "More than I expected." Most people do. Joe navigated a particularly sharp curve with practiced ease. "Daniel has a way of teaching what you need to learn, not just what you think you want to know." The truth of this observation stayed with Rebecca as they continued their journey. She had come to Piedra Creek seeking a cure, a way to make her seizures stop. Instead, she was learning to understand them, to work with them rather than against them. It wasn't the healing she had imagined, but perhaps it was the healing she needed. By mid-morning, they had reached the outskirts of Thornville. The small city seemed impossibly busy and noisy after the quiet of the mountains. Joe drove directly to the town's single hotel, a two-story building with a neon sign advertising clean. Rooms, vacancy. "Daniel said to meet him here," Joe explained as he parked. "Your father's staying in room 14. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest as they entered the hotel lobby. A bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from his newspaper as they crossed to the stairs. "Second floor," Joe indicated with a nod, leading the way up. They found Daniel waiting in the hallway outside room 14, his expression calm but serious. He greeted Rebecca with a nod, studying her face. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I don't know, but I'm here." Daniel's eyes held hers for a long moment. "Remember what you've learned. Your strength isn't in avoiding difficult things, but in moving through them differently than before." He knocked on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal Matthew Wilson. Rebecca's father looked older than when she had left him just days ago, his face lined with worry and fatigue. When he saw his daughter, a complex series of emotions crossed his features: relief, anger, confusion, love. "Becca," he breathed, reaching for her instinctively. Despite her misgivings, Rebecca stepped into her father's embrace, feeling the familiar solidity of him, smelling the soap and aftershave that hadn't changed since her childhood. For a moment, they clung to each other, the complicated present suspended in the simpler emotion of reunion. When they separated, Matthew looked over her shoulder at Daniel and Joe. His expression hardened slightly. "You must be Black Cloud," he said, addressing Daniel. "I'd like to speak with my daughter alone." Daniel nodded, seemingly untroubled by Matthew's barely concealed hostility. "Of course. We'll be downstairs when you're ready, Rebecca." As Daniel and Joe departed, Rebecca entered the hotel room. It was small and functional. A bed, a desk, a dresser, a window overlooking the main street. Her father's suitcase lay open on a chair, clothes neatly folded inside. "Your mother's worried sick," Matthew said as soon as the door closed behind them. "We both are. What were you thinking, Becca? Running off without a word?" The accusation stung, but Rebecca had anticipated it. "I left a note," she said quietly, "in your desk drawer, where you keep the newspaper clipping about Daniel." Matthew's expression shifted, surprise replacing anger. "You knew about that?" "I found it by accident, but once I saw it." She moved to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. "Dad, I had to try something different. Dr. Parker's treatments weren't working. They were making me worse, not better." Her father sighed heavily, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "Becca, I understand your frustration, but this man, Black Cloud, he's not a real doctor. These alternative treatments can be dangerous." Rebecca turned to face him, summoning the courage she had built over the past days. "He never claimed to be a doctor, and he never promised to cure me. That's the difference, Dad. He's helping me learn to live with my condition, not just fighting to make it disappear." Matthew's brow furrowed, the expression so familiar it made Rebecca's heart ache. How many times had she seen that look of worried confusion as he tried to understand her illness, to protect her from it? "What does that even mean? Learn to live with it. You've been living with it for years." "No," Rebecca countered, her voice stronger than she expected. "I've been hiding from it, fighting it, hating it and myself for having it. That's not living, Dad. That's just surviving." She moved to sit beside him on the bed, close enough to see the gray in his temples, the new lines around his eyes. "Daniel and his community have shown me a different way to think about my epilepsy. Not as something broken that needs fixing, but as part of who I am. A different way my brain works that has challenges, but maybe strengths too." Matthew looked skeptical. "Strengths? Becca, I've seen what these seizures do to you. How can that be a strength?" "I don't have all the answers yet," she admitted, "but I'm learning to recognize the early warnings, to work with the changing patterns in my body instead of just bracing for impact. And for the first time in years, I'm not afraid. Every minute of every day." The sincerity in her voice seemed to reach him. Matthew studied his daughter's face, perhaps noticing what others at Piedra Creek had commented on, a new clarity in her eyes, a steadiness that had been missing for years. "Your mother will want you to come home," he said finally. Rebecca had been preparing for this moment, the inevitable pressure to return to Pinecrest, to the life she had fled. "I'm not finished learning from Daniel," she said carefully. "There's more work to do." "Work? What kind of work?" "Understanding my condition better, learning techniques to manage it, maybe even finding a way to use what I've learned to help others." Matthew's eyebrows rose. "Help others? Becca, you can barely help yourself." The words stung, but Rebecca recognized the fear behind them, the same fear that had driven her parents to hover anxiously, to limit her experiences, to protect her from a world they believed would be too harsh for her fragile condition. "That's not true, Dad. Not anymore." She reached for his hand, feeling the calluses from years of farm work, the strength that had once seemed so absolute to her. "I'm stronger than you think, than I thought." A knock at the door interrupted them. Matthew rose to answer it, revealing Daniel standing in the hallway. "Mr. Wilson," Daniel said politely, "I wondered if I might join your conversation. There are things I believe you should know about your daughter's progress." Matthew hesitated, then stepped back, allowing Daniel to enter. The two men presented a study in contrasts, Matthew with his weathered farmer's build and practical clothes, Daniel with his dignified bearing and quiet assurance. Rebecca tells me you've been teaching her to live with her condition, Matthew said, a hint of challenge in his voice. What exactly does that mean? Daniel took the chair by the desk, his expression thoughtful. It means recognizing that your daughter's brain works differently but not defectively. The seizures are real, and yes, they can be dangerous. But fighting them with fear and medication alone is like trying to stop a river from flowing. Eventually, it will find its way. So you're saying she should just accept it? Give up on getting better? Matthew's voice rose slightly. Not at all, Daniel replied calmly. I'm saying that healing isn't always about elimination. Sometimes it's about integration, learning to work with the body's patterns rather than against them. Rebecca has shown remarkable aptitude for the techniques we've been practicing. Rebecca watched her father's face, seeing the struggle between his ingrained skepticism and his desperate desire to help his daughter. What techniques? He asked finally. Daniel glanced at Rebecca, a slight nod encouraging her to explain. I've learned to recognize the earliest warning signs, she said, to use breathing and movement to sometimes redirect the energy. I can't stop a seizure once it's starting, but I can prepare for it, make myself safe. She leaned forward, eager to make him understand. Dad, I had a seizure 2 days ago, but it was different. I wasn't lost in it completely. I maintained some awareness throughout. Matthew looked startled. Is that possible? It is, Daniel confirmed. With practice and the right support, Rebecca has only just begun, but she's already showing progress that suggests she could develop significant control. Hope and doubt warred in Matthew's expression. And the medications? Is she still taking them? A moment of tension filled the room. Rebecca had reduced her medication over the past days, finding that the mental clarity it gave her was worth the slightly increased risk of seizures, especially now that she was learning to manage them differently. I've been adjusting my dosage, she said carefully, working to find a balance that helps without the side effects that make me so foggy. Without consulting a doctor? Matthew's voice rose again. Becca, that's dangerous. Mr. Wilson, Daniel interjected gently, your concern is understandable. But consider this. Rebecca has lived with this condition for 9 years. She knows her body, her symptoms, better than any doctor ever could. Part of her healing is reclaiming that knowledge, trusting her own experience. Matthew fell silent, absorbing this perspective. Rebecca could see him wrestling with it, the traditional respect for medical authority against this indigenous healer's emphasis on personal wisdom and bodily knowledge. I want her to be safe, he said finally, his voice rougher than before. That's all I've ever wanted. Of course, Daniel agreed, safety is essential, but so is living fully. Finding that balance is Rebecca's journey now, not something others can decide for her. The conversation continued for hours, moving from the hotel room to a nearby diner where the three of them shared a meal. Rebecca watched as Daniel patiently addressed her father's concerns, neither dismissing his fears nor yielding to them. Gradually, she saw Matthew's rigid posture soften, his questions becoming more curious than confrontational. By late afternoon, they had reached an unexpected compromise. Rebecca would continue her work with Daniel for 2 more weeks. Then she would return to Pinecrest for a visit, bringing Daniel with her to meet her mother and Dr. Parker. Together, they would develop a long-term plan that incorporated both Western medical supervision and the techniques she was learning at Piedra Creek. Your mother will still worry, Matthew said as they prepared to part, the sun low in the western sky. But I'll tell her you're safe, that you're finding your way. Rebecca embraced her father, feeling the emotion that tightened, his arms around her. Thank you for understanding, she whispered, or at least trying to. Matthew pulled back, studying his daughter's face with new awareness. You seem different, he said simply. Steadier somehow. Rebecca smiled, recognizing the truth in his observation. I am. As they drove back toward the mountains, darkness. Falling around them, Joe at the wheel and Daniel quiet beside him, Rebecca felt a profound sense of having crossed a threshold. The confrontation she had feared had become a kind of bridge, connecting the life she had left behind with the new path she was forging. You did well today, Daniel said as the lights of Thornville receded behind them. It takes courage to stand in your truth when those you love see it differently. Rebecca gazed out at the darkening landscape, the mountains ahead now invisible but present, a solid reality waiting to receive them. He's trying to understand. That's more than I expected. Daniel nodded. The healing isn't just for you, you know. When one person changes, it creates ripples. Your father began his own journey today, whether he realizes it or not. The insight struck Rebecca as profound. She had been so focused on her own healing, her own struggle, that she hadn't considered how her transformation might affect those around her. If she could learn to live differently with her epilepsy, perhaps others could learn to see it differently too. Not as a shameful affliction, but as a complex part of a whole human being. The truck climbed steadily upward, headlights cutting through the darkness as they ascended toward Piedra Creek. Rebecca felt weariness settling into her bones, the emotional intensity of the day taking its toll. Yet beneath the fatigue was a current of something new, a tentative but growing confidence in her own capacity to navigate the complexities of her condition and her relationships. Daniel seemed to sense her thoughts. Rest now, he said quietly. Tomorrow brings new challenges. Rebecca leaned her head against the cool window, watching as stars appeared in the night sky above the mountain road. For the first time in years, she wasn't dreading tomorrow. Whatever challenges it might bring, she would face them not as a victim of her condition, but as its student, learning its language, respecting its patterns, finding the strength that had been within her all along. The truck rounded a bend, and suddenly the lights of Piedra Creek were visible in the distance, a small constellation of warmth against the darkness of the mountainside. Rebecca felt an unexpected surge of emotion at the sight. In just a few days, this place had become more than a treatment center or a temporary refuge. It had become a kind of home, a place where she was not defined by her limitations, but encouraged toward her potential. As they pulled into the settlement, Rebecca noticed a small gathering outside the community center, several figures moving in what appeared to be a dance around a central fire. The flickering light caught their gestures, transforming them into fluid silhouettes against the night. What's happening? She asked, curiosity overcoming her fatigue. A healing ceremony, Daniel explained. One of the children has been ill. The community gathers to lend its strength. The simple explanation moved Rebecca deeply. Here was healing, as a communal act, not the isolated clinical experience she had known. Sterile examination rooms, impersonal hospital corridors, the fundamental loneliness of being a patient. Joe parked the truck, and they walked toward Rebecca's cabin, the sounds of drumming and singing following them through the night. At her door, Daniel paused. Tomorrow, we begin the most challenging part of your work, he said, his expression serious in the moonlight. You've faced your fear. You've begun to understand your body's language. You've stood in your truth with your father. Now you must learn to integrate these experiences, to weave them into a new way of being. Rebecca nodded, understanding instinctively that this next phase would demand even more from her than what had come before. I'm ready, she said, and meant it. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, he agreed. I believe you are. As Rebecca prepared for sleep in her small cabin, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just a few days. She had arrived desperate and afraid, seeking an escape from her condition. Now she was beginning to see it not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as a complex aspect of herself to be understood and integrated. The realization didn't eliminate the challenges of living with epilepsy. She would still have seizures, still face the practical difficulties they created, but her relationship to those challenges had fundamentally shifted. Where once there had been only fear and resistance, now there was also curiosity, acceptance, even a tentative hope. Rebecca drifted towards sleep, the distant sounds of the healing ceremony like a lullaby carrying her into dreams. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as Daniel had said, but for perhaps the first time since her diagnosis, she would meet them, not as a victim, but as a student, a seeker, a person in the process of reclaiming her wholeness. In the days that followed, Rebecca's work with Daniel and Clara intensified. They focused on creating what Daniel called a map of awareness, a detailed understanding of the stages of her seizures, from the earliest subtle warnings through the event itself and into recovery. Most people experience seizures as a catastrophic event, Daniel explained as they sat in the healing lodge one morning. But there are actually many phases, each with its own characteristics, its own possibilities for intervention. Using the drumming techniques Clara had taught her and the meditative practices Daniel had introduced, Rebecca began to develop a nuanced awareness of her body's changing states. She learned to recognize not just the obvious aura that immediately preceded a seizure, but earlier, subtler signals. A slight change in her perception of colors, a barely perceptible tension at the base of her skull, an altered sense of time. These early warnings are your greatest opportunity, Daniel emphasized. If you can recognize them, you may have minutes or even hours to respond, to take medicine, to find a safe place, to use the techniques we've been practicing. No, the practical implications of this approach were profound. Rebecca had always experienced her seizures as unpredictable catastrophes that could strike at any moment. The possibility of having reliable early warnings and effective responses, to them, offered a degree of control she had never imagined possible. Clara continued to work with Rebecca on physical techniques, specific movements designed to help channel and balance the electrical energy in her body. Your hands and feet are pathways, she explained, demonstrating a sequence of precise gestures. When you feel the pressure building, direct it outward, away from your center. Rebecca practiced diligently, integrating these physical responses with the awareness techniques Daniel taught. Gradually, she began to develop what felt like a personal technology for managing her condition, not a cure, but a sophisticated set of tools that allowed her to work with her body's patterns rather than being helplessly subject to them. A week after her meeting with her father, Rebecca experienced a breakthrough. She was helping Sarah collect herbs on a hillside above the settlement when she felt the familiar pressure beginning to build at the base of her skull. Instead of panicking, she calmly implemented the protocol she had been practicing. First, acknowledging the sensation, then using specific breathing techniques to stabilize her system, finally engaging in the movement sequence Clara had taught her. To her amazement, the pressure subsided. The metallic taste that usually followed never materialized. The seizure, if that's what it had been building toward, receded without manifesting fully. It worked, she told Daniel later, still stunned by the experience. I felt it coming and I was able to redirect it somehow. Daniel nodded, unsurprised, but pleased. Your body is learning a new pattern. It won't always work so well. There will still be seizures that come too quickly or powerfully to divert. But now you have options where before you had none. The validation of her practice gave Rebecca a new confidence. She threw herself into the work with renewed energy, eager to refine and strengthen her growing abilities. At the same time, she began to engage more fully with the community at Piedra Creek, participating in daily activities and gradually forming friendships with Sarah, Joe, and others. One evening, as a group gathered in the community center for music and storytelling, an elder named Thomas invited Rebecca to join in a traditional dance. She hesitated, self-consciousness and old fears rising within her. "What if I have a seizure?" In front of everyone, she whispered to Sarah, who sat beside her. Sarah shrugged, her expression matter of fact. "Then we'll make sure you're safe until it passes, and the dance will continue. Your seizures don't stop the world, Rebecca." The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. All her life, she had experienced her condition as a catastrophic interruption of activities, of relationships, of normal life. The idea that it could be accommodated, integrated into the community's flow without drama or disruption, was revolutionary. Rebecca joined the dance, moving awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence as she learned the simple, repetitive steps. The drumbeat guided her, and the circle of dancers welcomed her without comment or special attention. For a brief, precious time, she was not Rebecca with epilepsy, but simply another person participating in a communal celebration. Later, walking back to her cabin under a star-filled sky, Rebecca felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The path ahead was not without challenges. She would need to return to Pinecrest soon, to face her mother and Dr. Parker, to begin the complex process of integrating what she had learned here with her life back home. But for the first time since her diagnosis, that future didn't fill her with dread. She had discovered resources within herself that she never knew existed: strength, resilience, and a capacity for growth that transcended her condition. Whatever came next, she would face it with new tools and a new understanding of herself. The morning of Rebecca's scheduled return to Pinecrest dawned clear and cold. Frost glittered on the ground outside her cabin, capturing the early light in countless tiny prisms. She'd been awake since before sunrise, packing her few belongings and preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. A soft knock at the door announced Daniel's arrival. He stood on her small porch, breath visible in the cold air, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "Ready?" he asked simply. Rebecca nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. 2 weeks at Piedra Creek had transformed her understanding of herself and her condition, but would that transformation hold when she returned to the place where she had always been defined by her limitations? Joe was waiting with his truck, engine already running to warm the cab against the morning chill. The three of them would travel together. First to Pinecrest for Rebecca's reunion with her mother and meeting with Dr. Parker, then to Denver, where Daniel had arranged to meet with a neurologist interested in integrating traditional healing practices with conventional medicine. As they drove away from the settlement, Rebecca watched the collection of buildings grow smaller in the side mirror. Sarah and Clara had come to see her off, along with others from the community she had come to know during her stay. Their farewells had been matter-of-fact, without the heaviness of permanent goodbye. "We'll see you when you return," Clara had said simply, as if it were a certainty. "Nervous?" Joe asked, glancing at her as they navigated the winding mountain road. "Yes," Rebecca admitted, "but not in the way I used to be." She considered how to explain the difference. "Before, I was afraid of what might happen to me. Now I'm more concerned about how to share what I've learned with people who might not understand it." Daniel nodded approvingly from the back seat. "That's the difference between fear that paralyzes and concern that prepares. One diminishes you, the other strengthens you." The journey to Pinecrest took most of the day, the landscape gradually shifting from rugged mountains to rolling hills, and finally to the flatter farmland surrounding her hometown. As familiar landmarks began to appear, Rebecca felt a complex mixture of emotions: nostalgia, apprehension, and a strange sense of distance as if she were returning to a place she had outgrown. "There it is," she said as they crested a hill, and Pinecrest came into view, a small cluster of buildings surrounded by farms and open fields. In the late afternoon light, it looked peaceful, almost picturesque. Joe slowed the truck as they entered the town limits. "Where to?" "My parents' farm is about 2 miles east," Rebecca directed. She noticed how small and contained the town seemed now, its single main street lined with familiar businesses, the general store where she'd had her first public seizure, the church with its tall white steeple, the small school building where she'd once hoped to teach. As they drove through town, Rebecca was acutely aware of heads turning to watch the unfamiliar truck pass. By the time they reached the Wilson farm, she had no doubt that news of her return, accompanied by strangers, would be circulating through Pinecrest. The farmhouse looked exactly as she had left it, 2 stories of weathered white clapboard with a wide front porch, surrounded by bare fields waiting for spring planting. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as Joe parked in the yard, the front door opened. Eliza Wilson stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. At the sight of her daughter stepping out of the truck, she rushed forward, crossing the yard with remarkable speed for a woman of her age and usually reserved demeanor. "Rebecca, oh, thank God." The embrace was fierce, almost desperate. Rebecca felt her mother's tears against her cheek, the familiar scent of baking bread and lavender soap enveloping her. When they finally separated, Eliza held her daughter at arm's length, examining her with the intensity only a mother can muster. "Are you all right? Your father said you looked well, but I needed to see for myself." "I'm fine, Mom. Better than fine." Rebecca turned to introduce Daniel and Joe, who stood respectfully a few paces back. "This is Daniel Blackcloud, the healer I went to find, and Joe Martinez, who's been kind enough to drive us." Eliza regarded the 2 men with a mixture of wariness and grudging gratitude. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home safely," she said finally. "Please come inside. You must be tired from your journey." The farmhouse kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking. Rebecca felt a wave of nostalgia as she entered the familiar space. The worn wooden table where her family had shared thousands of meals, the faded yellow curtains her mother had sewn when Rebecca was still a child, the ancient stove that had heated the house through countless winters. Matthew Wilson emerged from his study at the sound of their arrival. He embraced his daughter briefly, nodded to Daniel with cautious respect, and shook Joe's hand firmly. "You've made good time," he observed. "The roads must be clear." "We were fortunate with the weather," Daniel replied, his manner calm and assured even in this unfamiliar territory. Rebecca sensed the tension in her father's posture, the careful neutrality in his expression. Their meeting in Thornville had ended in an uneasy truce, but she knew he still harbored deep reservations about Daniel's methods and her decision to seek them out. Eliza, ever the practical hostess despite her emotional state, bustled about preparing tea and setting out freshly baked bread with butter and preserves. As they gathered around the kitchen table, the awkwardness was palpable. 2 worlds colliding, with Rebecca at the intersection. "I've arranged for you to see Dr. Parker tomorrow morning," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "He's very concerned about you stopping your medication without supervision." Rebecca felt a flash of the old frustration, the assumption that she couldn't be trusted to make decisions about her own body. But she took a deep breath, remembering Daniel's teachings about responding rather than reacting. "I haven't stopped my medication completely," she explained calmly. "I've adjusted the dosage to reduce the side effects while working with Daniel on other techniques to manage my condition." "What kind of techniques?" Eliza asked, her voice carefully neutral. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. Over tea and bread, she began to explain what she had learned at Piedra Creek. the awareness practices that helped her recognize early warning signs, the breathing and movement techniques that sometimes allowed her to redirect an oncoming seizure, the herbs that helped stabilize her system during vulnerable times. Her parents listened with varying degrees of skepticism, her father occasionally shaking his head, her mother's expression shifting between hope and doubt. "It sounds unusual," Eliza said finally. "It is unusual compared to what you're familiar with," Daniel acknowledged, speaking for the first time since they had sat down. "But these practices are based on generations of observation and experience, just as Western medicine is based on its own traditions of research and practice." Matthew leaned forward, his farmer's hands clasped tightly on the table. "With all due respect, Mr. Blackcloud, my daughter has a serious medical condition. It requires proper medical treatment, not—" He hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Alternative methods." Daniel met Matthew's gaze steadily. "I agree that Rebecca's condition is serious and requires proper treatment. Where we may differ is in our understanding of what constitutes proper. The techniques Rebecca has been learning are not meant to replace medical care, but to complement it, to give her tools to work with her condition in ways that medication alone cannot provide." Rebecca watched her father absorb this, noting the slight shift in his expression. Daniel's acknowledgement of the seriousness of her condition and the role of medical care seemed to ease some of Matthew's defensiveness. "Tomorrow," Daniel continued, "I hope to speak with Dr. Parker about how we might integrate approaches. In Denver, we'll be meeting with a neurologist who has been exploring similar combinations of traditional and Western medicine with promising results." The conversation continued through dinner, gradually shifting from the initial tension to a more open exchange. Rebecca shared stories of her time at Piedra Creek, carefully selecting examples that would help her parents understand rather than alarm them. Her work with Clara on the drum rhythms, the community dances, her growing ability to recognize the earliest signs of an oncoming seizure. As evening settled over the farm, Joe took his leave, planning to stay with a cousin who lived in a neighboring town. Daniel was shown to the spare room, and Rebecca found herself alone in her childhood bedroom for the first time since her abrupt departure. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The narrow bed with its patchwork quilt, the small bookshelf filled with volumes she had read and reread during the isolated years of her illness, the desk where she had spent countless hours writing, in her journal when seizures kept her from more active pursuits. And yet, nothing felt the same. The room seemed smaller, more confined than she remembered. The familiar objects that had once defined her world now felt like artifacts from a past life, important but no longer defining. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the quilt her grandmother had made. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation she had been anticipating and dreading, the meeting with Dr. Parker, the local physician who had treated her epilepsy since her first seizure, and who represented the medical approach that had dominated her life for 9 years. She was nervous, certainly, but no longer afraid. Whatever happened in that meeting, she had found something at Piedra Creek that couldn't be taken from her. A new relationship with her own body, a different understanding of her condition, and, most importantly, a sense of agency she had never before experienced. As she prepared for bed, performing the evening meditation Daniel had taught her, Rebecca felt a curious peace settling over her. She was home, but she was not the same person who had left. The true test would be whether Pinecrest could accommodate who she had become. Morning brought a light dusting of snow and the familiar sounds of farm life, her father moving about the barn, her mother in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Rebecca dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would present a capable, composed appearance to Dr. Parker. She wanted him to see her, not as the frightened, passive patient she had been, but as a partner in managing her condition. Daniel joined her for breakfast, his calm presence a steadying influence as they prepared for the meeting ahead. He had brought gifts for her parents, a small pouch of special tea for her mother, a carved wooden pipe for her father, simple offerings that nonetheless seemed to surprise and touch them. The drive to Dr. Parker's office was tense and quiet. Matthew insisted on driving them in the family car, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. Eliza sat beside him, occasionally glancing back at Rebecca and Daniel as if to reassure herself they were still there. The medical office was on Main Street, a small brick building with a discreet sign identifying it as Thomas Parker, MD, General Practice. As they entered the waiting room, Mrs. Henderson, who had been the receptionist for as long as Rebecca could remember, looked up in surprise. "Rebecca Wilson, your appointment isn't for another 20 minutes. "We're a bit early," Rebecca acknowledged with a smile. "Is it all right if we wait?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted curiously to Daniel, taking in his long hair and distinctive features. "Of course, dear. Dr. Parker is with a patient, but I'll let him know you're here." They sat in the small waiting area, surrounded by outdated magazines and faded prints of pastoral scenes. Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety as she looked around the familiar space, remembering all the times she had waited here, after her first seizure, after particularly bad episodes, for regular checkups that inevitably ended with adjustments to medications that never quite worked. Dr. Parker emerged from his office sooner than expected, a tall man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a perpetually serious expression. He had been the Wilson family's doctor for decades, delivering Rebecca and treating everything from childhood earaches to her father's broken arm after a farming accident. "Rebecca," he said, genuine warmth in his voice despite the concern evident in his expression. "It's good to see you. Your parents have been worried sick." His gaze shifted to Daniel, professional courtesy barely masking his skepticism. "And you must be Mr. Blackcloud." Daniel rose, extending his hand. "Dr. Parker, thank you for meeting with us." The doctor's handshake was brief but not dismissive. "Let's talk in my office, all of you," he added, nodding to Matthew and Eliza. The office was small but neat, medical diplomas hanging on one wall, a simple examination table along another. Dr. Parker seated himself behind his desk, gesturing for the others to take the chairs arranged before it. "So," he began, looking directly at Rebecca, "your father tells me you've been exploring alternative treatments for your epilepsy." There was no overt judgment in his tone, but Rebecca could sense his medical skepticism. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was no longer a passive recipient of care, but an active participant in her own healing. "Yes," she replied, steadily. "I've been learning techniques to help manage my condition more effectively than medication alone has allowed me to do." Dr. Parker leaned back slightly, studying her. "Your father also mentioned you've adjusted your medication without medical supervision. That concerns me greatly, Rebecca. Sudden changes in anticonvulsant dosages can trigger severe seizures." "I understand the risk," Rebecca acknowledged. "I reduced gradually, carefully monitoring my body's responses, and I've continued taking a maintenance dose." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by her confident, articulate response. The Rebecca he knew had been quiet, deferential, often foggy from medication. "And have you experienced any seizures during this experiment?" "One," Rebecca admitted, "but it was different. I maintained partial awareness throughout, which has never happened before. And yesterday, I was able to recognize early warning signs and use techniques Daniel has taught me to potentially prevent another from fully manifesting." Dr. Parker turned his attention to Daniel. "What exactly are these techniques? I should warn you that I'm not particularly receptive to unscientific approaches that might put my patient at risk." Daniel nodded, seemingly unperturbed by the doctor's skepticism. "I understand your concern. It's well-founded. Rebecca's condition is serious, and her safety is paramount." He went on to explain the approach they had been developing, the awareness practices, the physical techniques, the herbal supplements, framing them not as alternatives to medical care, but as complementary practices that might enhance the effectiveness of conventional treatment. To Rebecca's surprise, Dr. Parker listened attentively, occasionally making notes. He asked detailed questions about specific techniques, showing particular interest in the early warning recognition methods Rebecca had been practicing. "That's consistent with what we know about epileptic auras," he acknowledged. "Many patients report sensory warnings before a seizure, but few have developed systematic responses to them." He looked thoughtfully at Rebecca. "And you feel these techniques have given you more control?" "Not complete control," she clarified, "but yes, more than I've ever had before. And equally important, they've changed how I feel about my condition. I'm not constantly afraid anymore." Dr. Parker's expression softened slightly. "Fear can be as debilitating as the seizures themselves sometimes." He turned back to Daniel. "You mentioned a neurologist in Denver who's exploring similar approaches." Daniel nodded, producing a business card from his pocket. "Dr. Eleanor Winters. She's been documenting cases where traditional healing practices combined with conventional treatment have shown promising results for patients with various neurological conditions." Dr. Parker examined the card, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not familiar with her work, but I'd be interested to learn more." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, gradually shifting from confrontation to consultation. Dr. Parker expressed legitimate medical concerns, which Daniel acknowledged respectfully. Together, they began to outline what an integrated approach to Rebecca's care might look like. Continuing medication at a level that provided protection without debilitating side effects, regular medical monitoring, combined with the awareness and response techniques she had been learning. "I'd like to do a full examination before you leave," Dr. Parker said finally, turning to Rebecca. "And I want to adjust your prescription to better account for the reduced dosage you've been taking. Abrupt changes can be dangerous, but if a lower dose is working for you without increasing seizure frequency, that's worth exploring." Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude and validation. Dr. Parker wasn't dismissing her experience or Daniel's teachings. He was listening, considering, adapting his approach based on new information. After the examination, during which Dr. Parker noted that Rebecca's physical condition seemed improved, better color, clearer eyes, steadier hands, they finalized plans for her ongoing care. She would return to Piedra Creek to continue her work with Daniel, but with regular checkups with Dr. Parker and eventually a consultation with Dr. Winters in Denver. As they left the office, stepping back onto the main street of Pinecrest, Rebecca felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The meeting had gone better than she had dared hope. Not perfect. Dr. Parker still had significant reservations, but he had been willing to listen, to consider a broader approach than he had previously advocated. "That went well," Daniel observed quietly as they walked back to the car. Rebecca nodded, glancing at her parents who walked slightly ahead of them. Her father's posture seemed less rigid, her mother's expression more hopeful than anxious for the first time in days. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being willing to work with him, to find middle ground." Daniel smiled slightly. Healing isn't about winning arguments. It's about finding what works, what brings balance. Sometimes that means integrating seemingly opposite approaches. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of activity. Rebecca's mother had invited several close family friends for dinner, people who had known Rebecca all her life and had been worried by her sudden disappearance. Among them was Grace Miller, Rebecca's childhood friend, who was now planning her wedding. The evening could have been awkward, filled with uncomfortable questions about where she had been and what she had been doing. Instead, to Rebecca's surprise, it became an opportunity to share her experiences at Piedra Creek in a setting where people were genuinely interested and largely supportive. Grace, especially, seemed fascinated by Rebecca's transformation. As the other guests chatted over coffee and pie, the two young women slipped away to the front porch, wrapping themselves in quilts against the evening chill. "You seem different," Grace observed, studying her friend's face in the soft light spilling from the windows. More present, somehow. Rebecca smiled, touched by her friend's perception. "I feel different, like I've finally found a way to live with my epilepsy instead of just enduring it." "That's wonderful, Becca." Grace hesitated, then added softly, "I've missed you, and I've been worried. When your mother said you'd gone off to find some Indian healer." She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "You thought I'd lost my mind?" Rebecca suggested with a gentle laugh. "Something like that," Grace admitted, "but seeing you now, I understand. You needed to find your own way." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching their breath cloud in the cold night air. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Grace said finally. "Would you play the piano at my wedding? Not the whole ceremony, we've hired someone for that, but maybe one special piece during the service." Rebecca felt her heart catch. She hadn't touched a piano since her first seizure at the spring concert 9 years ago. The instrument that had once been her greatest joy had become inextricably linked with that traumatic moment. I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I haven't played in years." Grace squeezed her hand. "Just think about it, no pressure, but it would mean a lot to me." Later that night, unable to sleep, Rebecca found herself drawn to the parlor where the family's old upright piano stood against the wall. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, she could make out the familiar shape, the ivory keys gleaming faintly. Slowly she approached it, running her fingers lightly over the closed lid. This instrument had once been her refuge, her joy, her means of expression when words failed her. And then, in an instant, it had become associated with her greatest humiliation and the beginning of her life as the girl with seizures. With a deep breath, Rebecca lifted the lid and sat on the bench. The keys felt cool and smooth beneath, her fingertips achingly familiar despite the years of absence. Softly, barely touching the keys, she began to play a simple melody she had loved as a child. The notes rose in the quiet house, tentative at first, then gaining confidence. Her fingers remembered what her conscious mind had tried to forget: the patterns, the pressure needed, the way to coax music from wood and wire and ivory. As she played, Rebecca felt something shifting inside her, a wound beginning to heal, a circle completing itself. She had left Pinecrest seeking healing for her epilepsy, but had found something deeper, a way back to herself, to the parts of her identity she had abandoned in fear. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice Daniel standing in the doorway until he spoke softly. "The healing comes full circle," he observed, returning to what was lost. Rebecca's hands stilled on the keys. "I never thought I'd play again. After the first seizure happened during a recital, I couldn't bear to touch a piano." Daniel moved into the room, taking a seat in the armchair near the piano. "The greatest power of fear is its ability to separate us from what we love." Rebecca nodded, her fingers absently finding a chord. "Grace asked me to play at her wedding, just one piece. And will you?" She considered the question, feeling the weight of it. To play publicly again would mean facing the very situation that had marked the beginning of her life with epilepsy. It would mean risking another seizure in front of an audience, risking humiliation and pity. But she was not the same person. who had fled from the piano bench 9 years ago. She had tools now, awareness, techniques, and more importantly, she had a different relationship with her condition, not one of fear and shame, but of understanding and integration. "I think I will," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not because I'm cured or because I'm no longer afraid, but because I won't let fear decide what I can and cannot do anymore." Daniel nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. That is true healing, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of choice. The next morning, as they prepared to depart for Denver, Rebecca found herself looking at Pinecrest with new eyes. The small town that had felt like a prison for so many years now seemed simply a place, neither good nor bad in itself, only in how she related to it. Her parents stood in the yard, her mother teary-eyed but no longer desperate, her father solemn but no longer rigid with disapproval. "You'll call when you reach Denver?" Eliza asked, straightening Rebecca's collar unnecessarily. "Yes, Mom, and I'll be back for Grace's wedding in the spring." "To play," her father said, not quite a question. Rebecca nodded, meeting his gaze. "Yes, just one piece, but yes." Something shifted in Matthew Wilson's expression, pride breaking, through the concern that had dominated his interactions with his daughter for nearly a decade. "You'll do fine," he said simply, and in those 3 words, Rebecca heard what he couldn't quite say directly, that he was beginning to see her as capable rather than fragile, as someone who could face challenges rather than someone who needed constant protection. As Joe's truck pulled away from the farm, Rebecca watched her childhood home recede in the side mirror. The visit had been challenging in many ways, forcing her to confront old patterns and perceptions, but it had also been healing, allowing her to reconnect with her past without being defined by it. "How do you feel?" Daniel asked, as they turned onto the main road leading out of Pinecrest. Rebecca considered the question, taking inventory of her emotions. "Like I've closed a circle," she said finally, "not ending something, but completing it so something new can begin." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. The healing journey is rarely linear. It often brings us back to where we started, but with new eyes to see and new strength to move forward. As Pinecrest disappeared behind them and the road to Denver stretched ahead, Rebecca felt a sense of possibility opening. Before her, she was not cured. Her epilepsy remained a reality she would live with for the foreseeable future, perhaps forever. But she was healing in a deeper sense, reclaiming parts of herself that fear had taken from her and discovering new capacities she had never known she possessed. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks catching the morning light. Rebecca watched them draw closer, thinking of Piedra Creek nestled among similar peaks, of the community that had welcomed her, of the wisdom she had found there. She would return soon to continue her work with Daniel and Clara, to deepen her understanding of the tools they had given her. But first, Denver and Dr. Winters, another step in building bridges between the different approaches to healing, in creating a path that drew from both traditions to form something new and more complete. As the miles passed beneath them, Rebecca found herself thinking of the piano in her parents' parlor, of the notes that had risen in the quiet house, of the decision to play at Grace's wedding. It would be a kind of reclamation, a statement that her life would no longer be defined by what she feared might happen, but by what she chose to do, despite that fear. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Rebecca smiled, feeling a quiet confidence spreading through her. "I'm thinking about music," she said simply, "and about the future." 3 months later, Rebecca stood at the window of her small apartment in Denver, watching as spring brought color back to the city. The trees lining the street below were budding with fresh green, and crocuses pushed through the soil in the small garden beds flanking the building's entrance. After a winter of learning and growth, the world around her seemed to be reflecting her inner transformation. Her meeting with Dr. Winters in Denver had been a turning point. The neurologist, a slender woman with keen eyes and a no-nonsense manner, had listened to Rebecca's story with genuine interest rather than skepticism. She had examined the detailed journal Rebecca had kept of her seizures, her responses, and the effectiveness of various techniques Daniel had taught her. "This is remarkable documentation," Dr. Winters had commented, flipping through the pages of careful observations. "Most patients can't articulate their experiences with this level of precision." Over the winter, Rebecca had begun working part-time at Dr. Winters' clinic, serving as a bridge between the medical staff and the native healers who came to share their knowledge. The position had been Daniel's suggestion after he recognized Rebecca's unusual ability to translate between these different approaches to healing. "You understand both worlds," he had told her. "You can help others find their path between them." The work was challenging, but deeply fulfilling. Rebecca helped patients understand the traditional practices that complemented their medical treatments, and she helped the healers understand the language and concerns of Western medicine. In the process, she continued to deepen her own awareness of her body and her condition. Her seizures hadn't disappeared. She still experienced them occasionally, but their frequency had decreased, and more importantly, she had developed reliable ways to recognize their approach and sometimes redirect them. When a seizure did manifest, she no longer experienced it as a total loss of self, but maintained a thread of awareness throughout, allowing her to recover more quickly and with less fear. The apartment in Denver was a statement of her growing independence. Small but bright, it represented a step she had once thought impossible, living on her own, managing her condition without constant supervision. Her parents had been hesitant at first, but seeing her steadiness over the winter months had gradually convinced them that this next step was appropriate. A knock at the door pulled Rebecca from her thoughts. Opening it revealed Sarah, bundled in a light jacket against the spring chill, a basket over her arm. "Clara sent these," she said, entering with the easy familiarity of frequent visits. "Fresh herbs for your tea." Rebecca accepted the basket gratefully. "Please thank her for me. How is everyone at Piedra Creek?" Sarah settled onto the small sofa, unwinding her scarf. "Good. The spring ceremonies have begun. Daniel asked when you might visit again." "After Grace's wedding next week," Rebecca replied, arranging the fragrant herbs on her kitchen counter. "Will you stay for tea?" As they shared tea and conversation, Rebecca felt a deep appreciation for how her world had expanded. Sarah's visits to Denver had become regular as she pursued nursing studies at the university, creating a connection between Rebecca's new life and the community that had helped her find her path. Their conversation turned to the upcoming wedding. "Are you nervous about playing?" Sarah asked, knowing how significant this step was for Rebecca. "Yes," Rebecca admitted, "but it's a good kind of nervous, like standing at the edge of something important." She had been practicing for weeks, reacquainting her fingers with the keyboard, rebuilding the muscle memory that 9 years of avoidance had diminished, but not erased. The piece she had chosen, Debussy's Clair de Lune, was challenging but deeply meaningful, its gentle flow and moments of triumph reflecting her own journey. "Daniel says he'll attend," Sarah mentioned. "He wants to support you." The news surprised and moved Rebecca. Daniel rarely left his community except for specific healing work. His willingness to travel to Pinecrest for her performance spoke volumes about how he viewed her progress. The day of Grace's wedding dawned clear and perfect. The small church in Pinecrest decorated with spring flowers and white ribbons. Rebecca arrived early, her mother fussing with her dress, her father unusually quiet as he drove them from the farm. "Are you sure about this, Becca?" Eliza asked for perhaps the 10th time that morning. No one would think less of you if you decided it was too much." "I'm sure, Mom," Rebecca replied, meeting her mother's worried gaze steadily. "This is important to me." The church was already filling with people when she slipped through the side door to the small anteroom where the piano waited. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, familiarizing herself with their touch, then took several deep breaths, centering herself as Daniel had taught her. There was anxiety, yes, the natural tension before any performance, heightened by the memories of what had happened the last time she played publicly. But beneath it was a steady current of confidence, not in perfection, but in her ability to navigate whatever might come. As she waited, Rebecca became aware of movement at the door. Daniel entered quietly, dressed in a simple but elegant shirt and pants, rather than his usual practical clothing. The sight of him, a living connection to the place and experiences that had transformed her life, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "You came," she said simply. He nodded, his expression warm. "Some journeys we must witness to completion." Rebecca understood his meaning immediately. This performance represented the final closing of a circle, returning to the very situation where her old life had ended and her struggle had begun, but now with new strength and understanding. "What if?" she began, voicing the fear that still lingered despite all her preparation. "If a seizure comes, it comes," Daniel said calmly. "You know now how to move with it rather than against it." "But Rebecca," he added, his gaze holding hers, "your body remembers more than trauma. It also remembers joy. Trust that memory too." The organist's music swelled, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. Rebecca took her place at the piano, waiting for her moment in the service. As the bride and groom exchanged vows, she found herself fully present, appreciating the beauty of this celebration of love and commitment. When the minister nodded to her, Rebecca placed her hands on the keys. For a brief, terrifying moment, she felt the old fear rising, the memory of collapse, of public humiliation, of waking to concerned faces and whispered speculation. But then she reminded herself of all she had learned, of the tools she now possessed, of the different relationship she had built with her body and its patterns. With a deep breath, she began to play. The notes of Clair de Lune rose into the church's vaulted ceiling, tentative at first, then flowing with increasing confidence. Rebecca felt herself entering that special state where performer and music become one, where the technical aspects of playing recede and only expression remains. As the piece built toward its gentle climax, Rebecca felt the familiar pressure beginning at the base of her skull, the earliest warning sign of a potential seizure. In the past, this sensation would have triggered immediate panic. Now she acknowledged it calmly, continuing to play while implementing the techniques she had practiced so diligently. She adjusted her breathing, visualizing the electrical energy in her brain, finding balanced pathways rather than building toward overload. Her fingers never faltered on the keys, the music continuing to flow as she directed her awareness simultaneously inward to her body's signals and outward to the beauty she was creating. The pressure wavered, then gradually subsided. The seizure, if that's what had been building, receded without manifesting. Rebecca completed the piece, the final notes hanging in the air of the hushed church, before dissolving into silence. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then applause broke out, not the polite acknowledgement she had expected, but enthusiastic appreciation. As Rebecca rose from the piano bench, she saw faces turn toward her with admiration rather than pity, with recognition of beauty rather than fear of difference. Her parents sat in the front pew, her mother openly weeping, her father's usually stoic expression transformed by unmistakable pride. Daniel stood at the back of the church, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, his eyes reflecting understanding of all this moment represented. At the reception that followed, Rebecca was surprised by how many people approached her, not to ask about her health or to express surprise that she could perform, but to compliment her playing and ask if she might consider teaching piano in Pinecrest. "We've missed having music lessons available for the children," Mrs. Henderson explained. "The school board has been looking for someone qualified." The suggestion caught Rebecca off guard. Teaching music had been her dream before her first seizure, a dream she had abandoned as impossible given the unpredictability of her condition. Now, with her new understanding and tools, it suddenly seemed within reach again. "I'll think about it," she promised, genuinely considering the possibility, for the first time in years. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Rebecca found herself sitting with Daniel at a quiet table in the corner of the reception hall. "You did well," he said simply, "not just with the music, but with what came during it." Rebecca wasn't surprised that he had sensed what had happened. "The techniques worked. I felt it building, but I was able to redirect it." Daniel nodded. "That's valuable knowledge, but not the most important thing you demonstrated today." "What do you mean?" "You showed courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. That's the most powerful medicine of all." Rebecca considered his words, recognizing their truth. Her healing had not been about eliminating seizures entirely or pretending they didn't exist. It had been about finding the courage to live fully despite them, to reclaim the parts of herself she had surrendered to fear. "What happens now?" she asked. "Where does the path lead from here?" Daniel smiled slightly. "That's for you to determine. The tools are yours now. How you use them, what you build with them, that's your choice." The simple statement filled Rebecca with both awe and gratitude. Choice. The very thing her condition had seemed to take from her was now hers again. Not unlimited or unconstrained, but real and meaningful nonetheless. As the evening progressed, Rebecca found herself observing the celebration with a profound sense of connection. To this community that had known her all her life, to Daniel and the wisdom he had shared, to her own body with all its complexities and challenges. For perhaps the first time since her diagnosis, she felt whole rather than divided, integrated rather than at war with herself. The seizures would continue to be part of her life, she knew. There would be difficult days, setbacks, moments when the techniques failed to prevent an episode, but those events no longer defined her or limited her horizons. They were simply aspects of her particular journey, neither curses nor blessings, just realities to be navigated with the tools she now possessed. As she watched Grace and her new husband share their first dance, Rebecca felt a quiet certainty settling in her heart. Whether she chose to teach in Pinecrest, continue her work at Dr. Winter's clinic in Denver, or find some new path altogether, she would move forward not as the girl with seizures, but as Rebecca Wilson, musician, healer, bridge builder, between different ways of understanding the body and its mysteries. Daniel caught her eye from across the room and nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. In that simple exchange, Rebecca felt the completion of one journey and the beginning of another. Not a journey toward a cure, but toward a life fully lived, with all its challenges and possibilities embraced equally. The music changed, becoming livelier, and several people moved onto the dance floor. To her surprise, Grace appeared at her side, taking her hand. "Come on," her friend urged. "This celebration is for you too. You've come back to us." Rebecca hesitated only briefly, before allowing herself to be led into the circle of dancers. As she moved to the music, feeling the rhythm in her body without fear of how that body might respond, she knew that she had indeed come back, not just to Pinecrest, but to herself. And that, she understood at last, was the true medicine she had been seeking all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.